This is the first video lecture. It is on mixing colors, and so we're going to talk a little bit about the types of paint that we'll be using in class and how to use those correctly, as well as how to mix custom colors so that you can get the correct colors for your project. So for this next step of this project, what you're going to need is you're going to need to have your elevation, which I have my lovely little elevation here. I have it in a sheet protector because I like to test my colors directly onto the elevation and I don't want to have it smeared all over with paint. So you can put it in a plastic cover or something like that to keep it protected. Otherwise, you can just use a piece of white paper or an index card or something like that in order to keep your elevation clean. Okay. So what we use for scene paint in this class primarily are the Roscoe Off-Broadway colors. These are specifically formulated to be scenic paints. They're very concentrated in color. They are a latex acrylic base, so they're water-based. You can clean them up with soap and water. But they are a much more densely pigmented color than most of what the house paints that you get at the local hardware store are. The colors are also much more pure and they are much more consistent. So these are much closer to what artists use in studio as opposed to house paint. You can do most of the techniques that we're doing in this class with latex house paint, but you just don't have quite the same control over color. So we'll be using this. So for this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and try to mix this blue on this outside edge here, okay? And so when I look at my colors, I actually have 4 different stock colors of blue that we keep in the scene shop. And those are navy blue, which is a very sort of dark purpley blue, has a lot of black in it. What you'll find is if you add white to navy blue, it does go a little bit gray because there's quite a lot of black in it. We also have ultramarine blue, which is a much more intense blue. It is a much more saturated blue, much more closer to primary, but it does have quite a bit of purple in it. It leans towards the purple side of blue. Then we have phthalo blue, which is spelled with a P, and it is a little more of a green blue, okay? So there's a little bit of a difference there between the ultramarine and the phthalo. And then we have sky blue, which is a very light blue, does lean a little bit green, has a lot of white in it. So obviously you have to keep that in consideration. When you use it to mix, it's going to lighten up any color that you put with it, okay? So when I look at this, when I break down any color, what I want to do is I want to look at these blues that I have available and think, what is the one that is closest to what I'm trying to accomplish? And in this particular case, I think that is going to be the phthalo blue. When I look at this elevation, I see this as having a little bit more leaning towards the green than towards the purple. So I'm going to choose phthalo blue as opposed to the ultramarine blue or the navy blue or the sky blue. The sky blue is too light, and so I'm going to start with the phthalo blue. I may just change my mind on that later, but that's what I'm going to start with. So what I can do is I can just start with a little bit of a swatch, and sometimes I swatch just by doing a little dab on the paper, and I'm going to smush it out a little bit because if I just leave it in a big glob, it's going to have a little bit different color intensity to it. And yeah, I don't know, let's put the ultramarine next to it and see which one we like better. So when I look at these now, and you won't probably be able to see this very well, but the phthalo blue just looks like it's going to be a little bit closer, but it's not the exact same color, so I'm going to need to custom mix my color. So what I notice when I look at this is that it needs to be neutralized a little bit. It needs to be grayed out, and the value is also a little bit lower, right? It's a little bit darker. So in that case, what I'm going to choose to do, rather than neutralizing with the complement, which I could also do, which the complement of blue is orange, I could do that, but the orange might actually raise the value a bit. And so instead, I'm going to neutralize with one of my earth tones. Now, we have several different earth tone colors available to us. When I look at this, knowing what it needs to do, I'm going to say that there are two options that I think are going to work the best. One of which is burnt sienna, which is this kind of lovely reddish brown color, right? The other one is raw umber. Now, raw umber is an interesting color because it actually has a little bit of a yellowy greeny undertone to it, whereas the burnt sienna has more of a red undertone. It's a very not pleasant color sitting in the bucket, but it's really a useful color for neutralizing. Scenic artists use raw umber a lot because it is the closest thing to sort of a true neutral that we really have. It just tends to work with a lot of different colors without doing really funky things to it. So I'm going to start with raw umber and see what that does when I mix it with my phthalo blue. Okay, so again, I'm going to just do a little bit of a test here to see how this is going to work. And I could do this in a little cup, but sometimes if I'm just not sure and I'm just starting off, what I'll actually do is I'll just start with a little bit in my hand, and I'll actually just use my hand as a palette. You could also use an actual palette or a paper plate or something like that if you don't like just sticking paint on your hand. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just add a little bit of the raw umber into the phthalo blue and see what that does. And then I'm going to come back here to my elevation and I'm going to put a little swatch there. And it has gone a little too far, but it's closer. But now I look at this and I think, well, maybe because the raw umber has a little bit more green in it, maybe the ultramarine blue is actually going to be the better choice here. So I'm going to try a little bit of that. Let's see if that's a better decision. And it may be with a little bit of sky blue added into it. So I'm just going to keep messing around with these until I get something that I think is close, okay? Now I have something that when I look at it on here, it's like, that looks pretty close. Now, the other thing that I have to remember is that these paint colors will dry slightly different than what they look like when they're wet. Most of them dry lighter, but not all of them, so you always want to make sure that you test what it actually looks like when it's dry. But I feel like I'm close enough that I'm going to start mixing a little bit more to scale now. Okay, so I'm going to mix it in a quantity of what I need. For this class, you are never going to need a lot of paint. And for this particular project, you know, this little tiny bit of this quadrant, I'm going to need hardly any paint at all. I'm going to mix up a decent amount so that if I need to go back and use it somewhere else or paint back over something, touch something up, that I don't run out. But I don't need a half a gallon, right? These paints are meant to be diluted because the pigmentation is so intense in them. So we can actually mix a very little quantity and then we're going to add water to it until we get something that's about the consistency of like a heavy cream. If you know what the consistency of heavy cream is. It doesn't want to be so watery that it just spreads out, because obviously the thinner it is, the more your background color is going to come through it. And so that's something else that you have to take into consideration, is what's the background color. But for right now, we're just going to look at this on white. And so we're going to think about, you know, how much we're going to dilute that down. We're going to try and dilute it down to a reasonable quantity, okay? So I'm going to go wash my hands and then I'll be right back. Okay, so now I'm ready to start trying my mixture here. So I'm going to use plastic spoons, and you should use a separate spoon for each color of paint so that you're not cross-contaminating colors. You should always use a spoon or something to dip paint out of the bucket as opposed to pouring paint, because for one thing, if you try and pour it, you're going to end up with way more paint than you need. Also, this keeps the rooms a little cleaner so that we can actually get the paint cans to seal back up. And I'm going to keep track, right? So I'm going to start with 1 spoonful of my ultramarine blue. And these measurements are admittedly approximate, but that's okay. We're just trying to keep track so that later on down the line, if we need to mix more color, we actually know what we need. And I'm gonna do like a half a spoonful of the raw umber to start with. And maybe a half a spoonful of this, let's do a full spoonful of the sky blue. I think I'm gonna need to add more ultramarine eventually, but we'll find out. Okay, and get a clean spoon to mix that together. And because I'm mixing such a small quantity, it's a little difficult to get it mixed all up good, but we'll get there eventually. So there, I've mixed something, but it's really gray, okay? So I've really over neutralized it. So I'm gonna add another, we'll start with 1 spoonful of the ultramarine blue. The more you do this color mixing, the more you'll sort of instinctively know what colors you need to use. To start off with, you may not, which is another reason to keep your recipes so that you can, alter them as you need to, and so that you can mix these really small quantities to sort of start off and test things, so that we're not dumping a ton of paint down the drain. Well, never dump paint down the drain, but into the slop bucket. So now I've got something that's a little bit closer to what I'm looking for. So let me see, scratch this one off, see where we're at. And again, it's going to be very difficult for you to see this on the screen, but this is my swatch right here that I'm looking at. And I'm getting pretty close. It's the actual degree of neutralization is pretty good, but now I'm starting to think that it needs to be a little bit lighter again. So I'm going to add some more of the sky blue because the sky blue has that really nice light value to it. And I will say that mixing to print process inks, what you get out of a printer, is not the easiest thing in the world. So get close and you'll be fine. It's a different process. Printer ink uses the CMYK, which you probably have seen on your toolbar somewhere, right? That is the primary colors used in ink are cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So those are your main printer inks. It's a little bit different color system than what we use with red, green, blue, or red, yellow, red, yellow, blue. Red, green, blue is lighting. Red, yellow, blue is pigment, right? Primary system for color. So, okay. And test that again. Let's see where we are. Still looking a little bit dark, but I'm gonna dry it and see. So this may be obnoxious on recording. It's still a little bit off, but anyway, this should give you a good idea of what this process is. So I'm just going to keep manipulating this color until I get the right thing. Actually, at this point, what I'm seeing is that now it is a little bit too purple. So I may go back and add a little bit of ultramarine blue just to give it a little more intensity of color. The color is just looking a little too muddy right now. So I might give a little bit of a dab of the phthalo blue instead of the ultramarine, just to kind of brighten it up a little bit. Ooh, that's nice. So sometimes you need to use, multiple colors. It's not just about taking one color and saying, well, I'm just going to add, black or white to it. One note about making colors darker using black, under stage lights, colors that have a lot of black added into them tend to go really dull and flat, not in terms of sheen, but just in terms of their reflectivity, because we use so many different colors in stage lighting. So we try to avoid putting too much black into colors when we're mixing them. We try to do it with other colors, with complements, with earth tones. It just makes them pop a little bit better under stage lighting, gives it a little bit more life to the color. So there are times when you just have to use black because that's what you need to get the color that you want, but in most circumstances you sort of do that last, right? So I'm just going to say that for right now, let's say that I have mixed my color to the correct color that I want, okay? And so now you can see it's kind of it's got a little bit of fluidity to it. It's not super thick, but it's still pretty thick. So I'm gonna add a little bit of water, and I'm gonna add water very slowly, a little bit at a time, and just thin it down. Again, I'm looking for that kind of heavy cream consistency that has a little bit of, that still has some coverage, but isn't so thick that it's going to cause my brush to drag. That's one of the reasons that we like to paint with this little bit thinner paint. You get much cleaner lines if your paint is thinned down a little bit. If you're ever painting and your brush is really dragging, if you're trying to make a really clean line and your brush is just dragging, you're getting lots of little like dry spots where the paint isn't covering. Add a little more water to your paint, thin it down a little bit more. You can always do 2 coats. And so now I have something that is a nice creamy consistency. If I stick my finger in this, which, you know, if you're squeamish, you don't have to, but if I stick my finger in this and sort of smush it around between my fingers, you can kind of see the color of my skin tone underneath the paint, but you can still really see what the pigment color is, right? So if it's too thin, you'll see more finger. You want to see less finger, more paint. So it's also, you eventually, if you do this long enough, you can kind of stick your finger in the bucket of paint and just know from the feel of it if you have the right consistency for what you're trying to do. We'll be playing around with consistencies over the course of the semester. There will be times when we'll want something that's a little bit thicker. There'll be times when we'll want something that's a little bit thinner. But for most of the projects, at least starting out, this is about the consistency that you want to get it to. And you can maybe kind of see, but this little container is like, at this point, maybe less than a quarter full. And that's going to be plenty of paint to do the sections of that elevation that need to be done in full scale. So you don't need to mix up, you know, big buckets of paint for this project. These little containers, that's why we use them, because it keeps you from over mixing the paint and it keeps us from wasting the paint. So that is the basics of color mixing. Let me just consult my notes, make sure I haven't forgotten anything. Yeah, yes, that was all I wanted to talk about. So yeah, so that is the color mixing section, and there will also be another video here shortly on layout for the first project.